She was dying in the open sun, long before anyone found her. Her voice had already cracked into nothing, swallowed by the wind and the miles of empty Texas dust. Clara Banks hung twisted on that wooden cross in the middle of the Brazos flatland, one leg wrenched high by rope that cut deep into her ankle, her blouse torn open, her skin scraped bloody by splinters and the hands of men who had laughed while they tied her there. She kept trying to pull the fabric closed with her bound hands, but every movement only made her exposure worse. The worst part wasn't the rope burns eating into her wrists or the sun blistering her shoulders raw. It was the certainty that no one would ever see her as anything except ruined. A thing men had broken and left behind for the vultures. She whispered for help, even after her throat closed up. Even after she knew the Texas heat had no mercy for women like her. Even after she understood that dying alone was the only mercy left. Then a shadow cut across the dirt. A rider came slow from the east, dust rising behind a dark horse. She prayed it wasn't one of Harlow's men coming back to finish what they'd started. When he stopped his horse beside her, she looked up into a pair of gray eyes under the brim of a black hat. Eli Crow didn't speak right away. He just stared at what they'd done to her, his jaw working like he was chewing down something bitter that wouldn't go down. Then his gaze dropped, lower, past her face, past her torn collar, to the place she wanted hidden more than her own death. A wave of shame hit her so hard she couldn't breathe. Her voice tore out of her throat, raw and desperate and breaking. "Don't look there." Eli jerked his head away fast, guilt burning across his face like a brand. But he'd already seen it. The marks on her thighs, the burned skin, the numbers carved into her flesh, the proof of what kind of monster William Harlow really was. Now, the only question left, hanging in the boiling wind, was simple and terrible. Would this man ride away and leave her to die like decent people did when trouble got too ugly? Or would he do the unthinkable and risk everything to save a woman nobody was supposed to see? Eli didn't leave. Not after hearing her voice shake like that. Not after seeing the bruises and the mark nobody should carry on their skin. He stood there in the dust, trying to steady his breathing, trying to decide what kind of man he was going to be today. Most men would have ridden on, called it mercy to let the sun finish the job so she wouldn't have to carry the shame any further, told themselves they were being kind by not looking. But Eli stepped closer instead, slow, careful, like approaching a wounded animal that might bite out of pure terror. Clara twisted her body away from him as much as the ropes allowed, whispering again, softer this time, almost begging. "Don't look there." Eli swallowed hard. He lifted both hands, palms out, to show idiotcy wasn't a threat. "Ma'am, I ain't here to stare. I'm here because you're dying." His voice came out rough, low, weighted with something Clara hadn't heard from a man in longer than she could remember. Guilt, real guilt. Most men played the hero and lied through their teeth while doing it. They'd save you and make sure you owed them for it later. But Eli moved like a man haunted by the ghosts of women he hadn't saved before, like he was carrying around their names in his pockets and couldn't stand to add another one. He circled the frame slowly, checking the knots. His fingers brushed the rope, and he cursed under his breath, soft and angry, because the knots were designed to cut deeper with every breath she took, to make dying slow and shameful, Harlow style. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Clara flinched hard when she heard that name. Her whole body went rigid like she'd been struck. Eli leaned in close and spoke low, his voice barely louder than the wind. "If Harlow did this to you, he wasn't trying to punish you. He was trying to erase you." A tear slid down Clara's cheek, cutting a clean line through the dust caked on her face. She closed her eyes and tried to disappear inside herself. Eli touched her ankle gently, just 2 fingers checking if the circulation had already died, if the leg was too far gone. She jerked like he'd burned her with hot iron. "Easy," he said quietly. I'm just making sure you can still feel your foot." "I can feel all of it," she whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. "And I wish I couldn't." He looked up at her then. Their eyes met for the first time without fear or shame or desperation between them. Just two people seeing each other clear. The single look told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't guilty. She wasn't wicked. She wasn't anything Harlow had told the town she was. She was just a woman trying to survive a world that liked breaking the softest people first and calling it justice. Eli took a breath and made his choice. The kind of choice a man can't take back once he makes it. "All right, I'm getting you down." That's when the sound came. Hoofbeats, fast and close. Two riders returning at a gallop. Harlow's men. And the question that slammed into Clara's chest was cold and sharp as a January wind. Would Eli fight for her now that real danger was right in front of him? Or would he abandon her to save himself, like every other man who'd ever promised her anything? Eli heard those hoofbeats, and every old instinct in him snapped awake like a rattlesnake disturbed in the shade. He didn't have time to think anymore. Thinking got people killed. He stepped in close to Clara, close enough that she could feel the heat from his chest against her side, close enough to smell the leather and tobacco and sweat on him. "Hold on," he said quietly. Before she could ask to what, his knife flashed silver in the sun. The rope at her wrists snapped. "Free!" Pain flooded back into her arms as blood began moving again through veins that had gone cold and numb. She bit down hard on a cry, more from stubborn pride than actual strength. Eli cut the rope holding her leg suspended and caught her around the waist as she collapsed forward. Her full weight dropped into his arms and he grunted, taking a step back to steady himself. For half a second, her torn blouse slipped again, and she hissed through her teeth, frantic and desperate. "Don't look there." He didn't. He pulled his coat off in one rough motion and wrapped it around her body with quick hands that didn't linger anywhere they shouldn't. Hands that moved with purpose, but not possession. Two horses slid to a stop in a spray of dust and gravel. Harlow's men. The first one, a wiry man with a scar slashed across his mouth like someone had tried to shut him up permanently and failed, grinned when he saw Clara on the ground. "Boss said leave her till sundown. What the hell are you doing, Crow?" Eli straightened up slow, keeping Clara behind him with one arm. His voice came out steady and cold. "I'm changing the plan." The second man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt between them. He smelled like cheap whiskey and old cruelty, the kind that gets passed down from father to son like a family heirloom. "Heard you used to be a ranger. Thought you knew how to follow orders." Eli smiled without any humor in it, just a thin line across his face that didn't reach his eyes. "That's why I quit." The wiry one swung down from his saddle, boots hitting the ground hard. His hand dropped to the gun on his hip. "Step away from the girl, Crow. Last chance." Eli moved first, but he wasn't a young man anymore, and his body reminded him of that fact with every punch. His fist crashed into the man's jaw with a dull crack, and pain shot up his own arm like lightning. The man didn't drop clean like they do in dime novels. He staggered back and swung wild, knuckles catching Eli hard across the cheekbone. Blood filled Eli's mouth at once, hot and copper-tasting. He spat and swung again. The second man went for his revolver. Eli grabbed his wrist, but his grip wasn't as quick as it used to be, wasn't as strong. The man twisted free and drove a hard elbow into Eli's ribs, right where an old bullet wound from a bank robbery in Abilene, like to ache when the weather turned cold. White pain exploded through his side like a shotgun blast, and his knees dipped. His vision went gray at the edges. The gun slipped from the man's hand and hit the dirt near Clara's feet with a heavy thud. Clara moved on pure panic and something that felt like rage she'd been swallowing for years. Rage at men like this. Rage at a world that let them do whatever they wanted and called it natural. She snatched the revolver up with both shaking hands. The metal was hot from the sun and heavier than she expected. She'd never fired a gun in her life, never even held one, but she pointed it at the sky and squeezed the trigger hard. The shot cracked through the empty field like the voice of God announcing judgment. Both men froze, like they'd been turned to salt. Hands flew away from their belts. Eyes went wide. "You want to try that again?" Clara shouted, her voice shaking, but loud enough to carry across the flatland. "Next time I might not miss. And I got 5 more bullets that say you should get back on those horses." The men looked from Eli's bloody face to the woman with wild eyes and a smoking gun. And whatever courage the whiskey and Harlow's name had given them leaked right out of their boots into the dust. They backed toward their horses slowly, cursing and holding their bruised faces, then swung up into their saddles and rode off in a cloud of dust and shame. Eli wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. He spat a dark streak into the dirt and looked at Clara with something that might have been respect or might have been surprise, maybe both. "Can you sit a horse?" "I'll fall off," she whispered, her legs already shaking beneath her. "I'll catch you," he said, and something in the way he said it made her believe him. He lifted her into the saddle with a grunt that sounded like it came from his boots. Every muscle in his back screamed at him, but he ignored it. Then he swung up behind her, one arm solid around her middle so she wouldn't slide, the other taking the reins in a practiced grip. The horse leapt forward, away from that cursed frame, away from the place where Clara had been left to die, toward the distant line of the Caprock Hills rising purple and hazy against the evening sky. As the prairie wind hit her face, Clara tried to breathe deep, tried to feel grateful for being alive, but the world kept tilting sideways. Her fingers loosened in the horse's mane, and her head fell back against Eli's shoulder. "Stay with me," he murmured close to her ear, but her eyes were already rolling shut. The last thing she felt was the steady beat of his heart against her back, strong and alive. Then the world went dark, and she fell into it, like falling into deep water. If this story made you feel something, go ahead and tap like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Grab your coffee or tea and keep listening to these Old West Hearts. And tell me in the comments on what time it is, where you are, and where you're listening from, because your story matters too. By the time the Capric Hills rose up like broken teeth against the darkening sky, Clara wasn't fighting the saddle anymore. She was out cold, her weight sagging heavy against Eli's chest, hot with fever that seemed to radiate through his coat. Her breathing came shallow and ragged. Each breath a small fight she was losing. An old scar along Eli's ribs from a gunfight in a town called Abilene throbbed with every breath he took. But he ignored it the way he'd learned to ignore most of his own pain over the years. Pain was just information. You acknowledged it and kept moving. He guided the horse off the main trail, along a narrow deer path that wound between red rock and juniper scrub. The shadows grew long and cool as they climbed higher. They finally stopped in a shallow canyon above the Concho River, tucked under a wide shelf of limestone where the stone had been hollowed out by 1,000 years of wind and rain. It wasn't much, but it would hide them. That night, her fever broke loose like something wild. She shivered so hard her teeth chattered, then burned so hot he thought she might catch fire from the inside. She mumbled half-words in her delirium. About brands and numbers, and a man's boots crushing her throat. About cattle that weren't supposed to be there. About being tied down while they heated the iron red. Eli soaked his bandana in the cold river and laid it across her face, her neck, her arms, the unmarked parts where he could touch without causing more pain. He worked in slow circles, patient as prayer, till his own fingers went numb from the cold water. He propped her up against his chest and poured water between her lips a little at a time, waiting till she swallowed before giving her more. Once, deep in the worst of the fever, her hand clawed weakly at his shirt, and she whispered it again, broken and desperate like a child's prayer. "Don't look there." Eli swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. "I'm not," he said quietly into the darkness. "I'm just keeping you here. You hear me? I'm keeping you here." By the second sunrise, something had shifted. Her breathing had settled into something deeper and more regular. The wild shine in her eyes had faded to something tired but clear and human again. She hated how weak her legs felt, how her hands shook when she tried to sit up. But she also felt the steady strength in him. The way he moved around her like carrying her weight wasn't a burden at all, like she was worth the effort. He set her down carefully on a blanket he'd spread in the shade and stepped back immediately, giving her space to pull his coat tighter around herself, giving her back the dignity of choosing. "I need to look at that leg," he said quietly, not moving closer yet. Clara flinched. Her hand went to the coat, holding it closed. "Not there." His gray eyes met hers and held steady. "Not for me, for you. That wound could kill you if infection sets in. I've seen it happen." He knelt beside her, but kept his gaze locked on her face while his hands worked at the torn fabric of her skirt. "Tell me when," he said. "You're in control here." Only when she gave a tiny nod, her jaw set tight, did he let his eyes drop. Just long enough to see the damage. The brand was worse than he'd thought. The skin around it was angry red and swollen, ringed with ugly purple bruises that spread like spilled ink. There was dried blood where the rope had rubbed her raw, and newer blood where the scabs had cracked open. The numbers were clear, though. Clear enough to prove everything. He let out a slow breath through his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm, to not let her see the rage building in his chest like a thunderstorm. "That man should be in chains," Eli muttered. "That man owns half the cattle in Tom Green County," Clara answered, her voice flat and tired. "And the sheriff eats supper at his table every Sunday after church. They pray together." She watched his jaw tighten, watched the muscle jump beneath his skin. "Is that why he did this to you? Because you threatened his money?" "Because I saw too much." Her laugh came out bitter and thin, sharp as broken glass. "I kept the books for him, recorded the sales, tracked the herds. I was good at numbers. My daddy taught me before he died. I saw his men cutting other brands off hides in the middle of the night. Saw extra cattle on the drives, more than any neighbor reported missing. The numbers didn't add up, and I told him so. Thought he'd want to know about the theft." She swallowed hard. "He said my eyes were the problem. Said I saw things that weren't there. When I told him I was going to the sheriff, that's when he—" She stopped, couldn't say it. "Next thing I knew, I was tied to that frame, and he made sure the only thing anyone would talk about was my shame, not his theft. Made sure my word would never mean anything again." Eli cleaned the wound as gently as he could, using water from his canteen and a strip of clean cloth he tore from his own shirt. Every touch must have burned like fresh fire, but she didn't cry out. Just gripped the blanket in white-knuckled fists and breathed through it. The care behind his touch cooled something in her heart she'd thought had died back there on that frame. "You didn't have to come back for me," she whispered. "Most men wouldn't have." "Maybe not," he said, not looking up from his work. "But I saw what he carved into you. Saw what he wanted the world to think you were. If I ride away from that, if I pretend I didn't see it, I'm no better than him. I'm just another man who looked away when it mattered." They sat there as the sky turned from blue to gold to deep orange. Two people who had almost been strangers that morning, now bound together by a secret written on her skin in scar tissue and rage. Clara stared at the fading light and asked the question that had been clawing at her insides since he cut her down. "Eli, what are you going to do when Harlow comes looking for you? Because he will. Men like him always do." She turned to look at him. "Are you going to run? Or are you going to ride back into that town and drag his sins into the sunlight for everybody to see?" Eli didn't answer right away. He just watched the sky bleed from gold to red to purple like it was thinking right along with him, weighing the same terrible options. "When I was younger," he finally said, his voice quiet and measured, "I wore a silver ranger star and did what I was told. Followed orders, even when they didn't sit right. I watched people get hurt because I looked the other way. Told myself it wasn't my job to question things, just to enforce the law as it was written." He paused. Took me too long to understand that sometimes the law protects the wrong people, that sometimes looking away is the worst thing you can do. But we're not riding into San Angelo tomorrow, he added, looking at her directly. Not with you barely able to stand and me breathing like a broke-down mule. We'd both be dead before we reached Main Street. Instead, he took her to a small ranch in the next valley over, a weathered spread of adobe and rough timber run by a man named Samuel Holt. Samuel was a former cavalry officer who owed Eli his life from a night years back when the Comanche came down hard on a supply wagon, and Eli had stayed to fight when everyone else ran for cover. That kind of death doesn't fade with time. Samuel took one look at Clara, at the brand on her leg and the bruises covering her arms and throat, and his weathered face went stone cold. He didn't ask questions, just nodded once and showed them inside. By the next evening, there were 5 more men gathered around Samuel's kitchen table, all of them gray at the temples, all of them carrying old scars on their bodies and fresh grudges in their hearts against cattle barons who thought they owned the whole territory along with everyone in it. Samuel poured coffee, thick and black enough to float a horseshoe, and nobody said a word till the cups were empty. They were tired men who had seen too many bullies stay rich and walk free, while good people got ground into the dust. Samuel's oldest son, a lean man named Thomas, who'd learned telegraphy in the army, sent careful messages up to Fort Concho. Messages with Eli's name on them and Samuel's, and the names of 3 other men who'd seen Harlow's crew running stolen cattle through Dead Man's Canyon at night when they thought no one was watching. Samuel's younger son rode hard into San Angelo to find and hire a photographer. Not just any photographer, one who could be trusted, who wouldn't run straight to Harlow with the story. He found a man named Chen, who'd come west from San Francisco, who carried his camera equipment on a sturdy pack mule and asked questions with his eyes instead of his mouth. Chen came quiet to the ranch as the sun was setting. Clara set her jaw and made herself stand still while they set up the camera. Made herself hold steady while Chen disappeared under the black cloth and told her not to move. She let them photograph the brand and the bruises and the rope burns. Let them create proof that could travel farther than her voice ever would, that could speak in courtrooms and military offices, where her word as a woman would mean nothing. A few days later, when Clara could walk without her legs shaking, and Eli could breathe without his ribs screaming, they rode back into San Angelo. Samuel and the other old soldiers rode with them, a grim parade of men who decided they were done watching from the sidelines. William Harlow stepped out from his office when he saw them coming, flanked by his men. He was red-faced and sure of himself, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than most families made in a year. He pointed at Eli and his voice carried down the street. "That man is a fool and a lawbreaker. He assaulted my employees and kidnapped a woman who was being lawfully punished for her crimes. He's been blinded by the lies of a wicked woman who stole from me." The street had gone quiet. People emerged from shops and houses, drawn by the commotion. This was the moment Clara had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. Her hands shook as she dismounted. Her legs felt weak beneath her. But her voice, when she finally spoke, didn't shake at all. She stepped out in front of them all, in front of the shop owners and their wives, in front of the ranch hands and the preacher, in front of everyone who'd ever looked through her like she was already gone. "You told them not to look at me," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. "You told all of them not to look because if they ever did, if they really looked, they would see what you really are." With Eli standing solid beside her, with Samuel and the others forming a wall at her back, she opened the coat. She showed them the brand Harlow had burned into her leg, the numbers that proved she'd been marked like cattle, like property, like something less than human. Proof that the man they feared and respected had never feared ruining a woman completely, just to protect his stolen wealth. An officer from Fort Concho was already there, had ridden in 2 days before because of the telegram Samuel sent. He stepped forward now, a tall man with captain's bars on his shoulders and a face that had seen too much to be shocked by anything anymore. He asked his questions, quiet, direct, official. Other men came forward then, men who'd been afraid before but found their courage in Clara's example. They talked about cattle that disappeared and reappeared with different brands, about night drives through the canyon, about the sheriff who looked the other way for a cut of the profit. By the end of that week, William Harlow wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the one being watched, being judged, being measured and found wanting. He was the one being led away in irons, while the whole town stood silent and watched. Some of them looked ashamed. Most just looked away. Later on, after the dust had settled and the stories had been told and retold, Clara stood on the porch of Eli's small cabin outside of town. She looked out over a field of prairie grass that didn't feel cursed anymore, that just felt like land where anything might grow. "You know," she said softly, "if you had ridden away that first day, I would have died thinking I wasn't anything but that mark he put on me, just a thing he'd broken and thrown away." Eli shook his head slowly. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're not the brand, Clara. You never were. You're the woman who survived the iron. There's a difference." She turned to look at him. "What difference?" "The brand is what he did to you. What you are is what you did after. You rode back into that town. You showed them the truth when it would have been easier to hide. That's not weakness. That's not shame. That's strength most people don't have. Now, this isn't really a story about bullets or cattle or even justice, though all of those things are in it. It's about one question every person has to face sooner or later in one form or another. When they tell you not to look, when they tell you to turn away from someone else's pain because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable or dangerous, do you look away and protect yourself? Or do you look straight at the truth and stand your ground, even when standing might cost you everything? If this story made you feel something, go ahead and tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next ride. Grab your coffee or tea, keep listening to these old West Hearts, and tell me in the comments what time it is, where you are, and where you're listening from, because your story matters too.